Oh, from this time forth my thoughts be bloody, or be nothing worth. The king is dead, murdered by his brother Claudius. Prince Hamlet is tasked with avenging this murder most foul, the death of his father. So begins William Shakespeare's Hamlet. Throughout the play, Hamlet has many occasions to kill Claudius. Yet, he repeatedly fails to do so. At the last moment, he changes his mind, he gets lost in thought, or some other circumstance prevents him from carrying out the vengeful murder. This procrastination is one of the major themes of the work, and one of the most debated questions in all of Shakespeare. Just why is Hamlet so hesitant? Sigmund Freud linked Hamlet's hesitation to the Oedipus complex. René Girard argued that Hamlet's paralysis is caused by his realization that violence begets violence and traps us into a never-ending cycle of death. Numerous commentators subscribe to the view that Hamlet is nauseated with existential angst. Thrown into the world with total freedom and myriad possibility, the dizzying supply of choice overwhelms him. As for this final interpretation, Nietzsche had the following to say about it. Hamlet is not about the cheap wisdom of John Dreams, who from too much reflection, as it were from a surplus of possibilities, does not arrive at action at all. Not reflection, no. Nietzsche penned down his own interpretation of Hamlet's inaction in his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy. Heavily inspired by Schopenhauer, he offers a uniquely metaphysical interpretation of this Shakespearean masterpiece. By the way, we're working on a deep dive video covering all of The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche's first work, in the same way as we've done full analyses of other works of Nietzsche right here on the channel. So please subscribe if you don't want to miss this video when it comes out. One of the interesting things about The Birth of Tragedy, being Nietzsche's first work, is that it's still steeped in the metaphysics of Schopenhauer. Later in his intellectual career, Nietzsche would disavow this kind of metaphysical thinking and turn against Schopenhauer. But in this book, this 180 hasn't happened yet. We are presented with a youthful Nietzsche who more or less completely integrates Schopenhauer's philosophy into his own. And it's through this framework that Nietzsche discusses Greek tragedy, its origins, its evolution, and its necessity for culture and life. The book is mostly about Greek tragedy, as it came into being in pre-Socratic Greece. But in one paragraph, he dedicates a few words to Shakespeare's Hamlet, probably the most influential tragedy of all time. Actually, it's not so much an interpretation as an illustration of a broader concept he introduces in this work. Let's take a closer look. The Birth of Tragedy is most famous for introducing the twin concepts of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. They represent two aesthetic drives, impulses in the Hellenic soul. They are named after Greek gods because for Nietzsche, the ancient Greeks exemplified these impulses to perfection. They stand opposed to each other, and yet their synthesis is possible. The Apollonian is the drive towards delineation, reasonableness, rationality. The Apollonian is the force that delights in forms, distinction, demarcation. But what really interests us, for the purposes of this video, is the Dionysian. The Dionysian is chaos, the blurring of lines, the overcoming of limits. Named after the god of wine and intoxication, the Dionysian represents the drive in man for exaltation. Dionysus is free from restriction. It represents total freedom, but a downward freedom, a freedom into the dark recesses of the human spirit, unbound by the illusions of daily life and societal expectation. We still use the word bacchanal today, derived of course from Bacchus, the Roman version of Dionysus, to describe excesses of hedonism, like the booze-filled orgies of Roman emperors. Things become more interesting yet as Nietzsche transplants these twin concepts of the Apollonian and Dionysian onto Schopenhauer's metaphysical system, in which the world appears to us in two ways, as representation and as will. The Apollonian is linked to the world as representation, the world as we ordinarily experience it. We mentioned earlier how the Apollonian is the force of delineation and rational reasonableness. This is precisely what defines the world as representation. In Schopenhauer's system, he calls this the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation. It's because of this principle that we, as experiencing subjects, can make a distinction between objects in space and moments in time. The world of representation is a world of distinction, here and there, now and then, you and me. But ultimately, Schopenhauer argues, this world of representation, with its principle of individuation, is an illusion. The principium individuationis is something like a filter used by our mind to mold reality into something intelligible to our human reason. Beyond these limits and borders imposed on our worldview by this principle lies the world as will. Nietzsche identifies this world with the Dionysian. As we mentioned, the Dionysian is the blurring of lines and overcoming of limits. In the Dionysian group setting, think of a music concert or certain bedroom activities, individuals lose their sense of individuality and are submerged into the group. Just like how in the world of will, without the principle of individuation, things lose their distinction. The will is one. There is no here, no there, no now, no then, no you, no me. There is only will. By linking the Dionysian to the will and the Apollonian to the representation, Nietzsche adds something else to the conversation. The representation, the Apollonian, with its limits and rationality, is an illusion. The Dionysian, the will, is the truth. And the truth is ugly. The world is a place of suffering. On this, Nietzsche and Schopenhauer agree. Suffering arises because the will, which is fundamentally one, must, through the principle of individuation, be broken up in separate pieces, each fighting for primacy over the other. In the world as will, everything is one. But as the will objectifies itself into representation, it becomes a plurality of things. It's then that suffering is introduced. Plants fight each other for sunlight. Animals eat each other. Humans wage war against other humans. Schopenhauer summarized this eternal struggle by saying that each living animal is the graveyard of 1,000 other animals. In reaching the Dionysian state and moving beyond the ordinary limits of daily experience, the Dionysian man gets a glimpse of the true nature of things. He descends into a world where all is one, and suffering ceases to exist. He temporarily escapes the pain of the world, because he moves away from the world in which lions eat rabbits. He exists, as it were, on another level, on the level where such distinctions become meaningless, where the rabbit and the lion are one. This is the Dionysian state, but such a state cannot last forever. At some point, we must return to the world of illusion, where suffering reigns supreme. For we must know that in the rapture of the Dionysian state, with its annihilation of the ordinary bounds and limits of existence, there is a lethargic element, wherein all personal experiences of the past are submerged. It is by this gulf of oblivion that the everyday world and the world of Dionysian reality are separated from each other. But as soon as this everyday reality rises again in consciousness, it is felt as such and nauseates us. An ascetic, will-paralyzing mood is the fruit of these states. As we return to regular existence and awake from the Dionysian trance, we see through the illusion of the world. And this realization nauseates us. This nausea, this sickness, it paralyzes us. It stultifies action. We see very clearly the pointlessness of it all. Where does this pointlessness come from? We realize that we are simply objectifications of the will. Our individuality and our actions are merely illusions. In the domain of the will, there is no time and there is no space. There is an eternal, endless present in which everything happens all at once and in the same place. Being in the world, doing things, it means participating in the illusion. It means to engage with it, affirm it. But this affirmation is useless, because action, quite literally, does not exist in the world as it really is, beyond everyday illusion. The lion and rabbit are one. The lion cannot eat, and the rabbit cannot be eaten. Our actions are only meaningful in a domain where our actions can affect something. But the Dionysian man has just realized that this effect is an illusion, and therefore that all action is useless. That is where the paralysis of the Dionysian man comes from. Finally, we arrive at Hamlet. Hamlet's indecision, procrastination, and his paralysis are one of the most striking features of the tragedy. And with this Nietzschean exposition laid out, we can see how this character fits the Dionysian mold. Hamlet is no longer simply some kind of proto-existentialist who is paralyzed because of the dizzying freedom of choice, as if he can't decide between vanilla ice cream or strawberry, and therefore doesn't choose at all. It's much deeper than that. Nietzsche integrates Hamlet into a grand philosophical worldview that synthesizes elements from Schopenhauer with Dionysian psychology. Suddenly, Hamlet becomes the prototypical Dionysian man, the singular soul who saw through the world of illusion and becomes acutely aware of the true nature of things, the fact that the world is fundamentally timeless and spaceless, but that an illusory veil convinces us that our actions, nonetheless, have meaning. He becomes intimately acquainted with the eternal suffering that lays at the heart of things, and at the same time realizes that redemption is impossible, that no action can make things right. So why kill Claudius? Why avenge his father's death? Why do anything at all? Why even live? To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. Let's take a look at the final lines of this famous soliloquy, and keep in mind Nietzsche's words on the Dionysian state of man, and what happens when we exit that state and return to everyday reality, the world of illusion. The everyday world and the world of Dionysian reality are separated from each other. But as soon as this everyday reality rises again in consciousness, it is felt as such and nauseates us. Notice how he uses the word consciousness. The rational Apollonian realization clashes with the visceral emotional insight of the Dionysian. Thinking is opposed to action, because thinking leads to the realization of the uselessness of action. Now compare Hamlet. Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied over with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard their currents turn awry, and lose the name of action. Hamlet's doubt on whether to live or die is the ultimate expression of his paralysis, but it also applies to his hesitancy when it comes to killing Claudius. Time and again, Hamlet wastes the chance to carry out this deed. Not only does this make for compelling, tension-filled storytelling, it also shows us how Hamlet realizes the futility of doing anything at all. And this realization ultimately leads him to question the value of life itself. Hamlet is the ultimate Dionysian man, having descended to the depths of human experience and reality of the world. Having emerged from this abyss, he sees the world as it is, a pile of misery without redemption. Of course, the play is not devoid of action. In the end, Hamlet does kill Claudius, but only after he is mortally wounded himself. In fact, the entire Danish royal court perishes, except for Horatio, who lives to tell the tale. Thus, the end of the play is also the end of its world, the will extinguished at last. Nietzsche uses Hamlet to illustrate his ideas about the conception of Greek tragedy. As mentioned at the start of the video, he doesn't spend a lot of time on Hamlet itself, only a few sentences in a single paragraph. It's up to us to fill in the gaps. He goes on to explain the need for the saving grace of art, and before we know it, Nietzsche is back to discussing Greek tragedy. Hamlet is left behind, having outlived his usefulness, so to speak. We will have a video on the whole work of the birth of tragedy out soon. It will be a deep dive on the Apollonian and Dionysian, the genealogy of Greek tragedy, Wagnerian art, and even the meaning of life. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it. With that said, thank you for watching, and thank you to our Patreons who make these longer videos possible, as without their support the channel would surely die a slow death, just like Hamlet. If you want to support the work we do here, check out our Patreon page. In the higher tiers, you'll even have access to exclusive videos. If you want more Nietzsche, we've done a video on Twilight of the Idols. And if you enjoyed the discussion on Schopenhauer's philosophy in this video, check out our analysis of his main work, The World as Will and Representation. Again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.